There are moments in your life when God steps in and cuts something loose, a relationship, a habit, a mindset, a season. And the tragedy is not that God cut it, but that you keep trying to tie back together what heaven has already severed. Somebody in this room has been fighting to hold on to what God has already dismissed. You've been stitching up yesterday while God is trying to clothe you for tomorrow. Church, hear me today. When God cuts the tie, when he severs the connection, when he removes the attachment, it is not punishment, it is preparation. There's a divine pruning happening in your life, and some of you are grieving what God has already outgrown in you. You're crying over doors that God himself locked. You're chasing people God himself released. You're resurrecting things God himself buried. But today, right now, I came to declare, stop retying what God cut. Because every time you try to reattach what God removed, you delay your next level. If God cut it, it means you don't need it on the next stage of your destiny. If God cut it, it means you outgrew it. If God cut it, it means he's clearing the runway so your purpose can finally take off. Look at somebody and say, let it go before it costs you your future. When God cuts something from your life, it is almost never in the way you expect and rarely on the schedule you prefer. But often the very things you hold on to the tightest are the things God must forcibly remove, not because he is cruel, but because he sees what you cannot. There are relationships you would have stayed in forever had God not broken them. There are opportunities you would have clung to even while they were draining you had God not shut the door. There are habits, mindsets, comforts, and people you would have carried into the next season, even though they were never equipped to survive there. And because you wouldn't cut the tie, God had to, not to hurt you, but to save you. God cuts what you want. That's a truth. Every believer learns the hard way. We love to pray for breakthroughs, but we rarely pray for breakaways. We want increase, but not interruption. We want elevation, but not separation. And that's why the scissors of God are often uncomfortable, because they slice through attachments we've built our identity around. That friend group you thought you needed, God cut it because you couldn't see how their influence was quietly suffocating your purpose. That job you prayed to keep, God cut it because as long as you stayed there, you would never step into the calling he placed on your life. That relationship you begged him to fix, God cut it because the person you were trying to keep was distracting you from the person you were becoming. Sometimes God cuts because you refuse to. You were too loyal to what was limiting you, too emotionally tied to what was damaging you, too afraid of the unknown to release what was familiar. So God, in his mercy, not his anger, made the decision for you, because he would rather see you cry for a moment than crumble for a lifetime. He would rather you feel the sting of separation than the destruction of stagnation. He would rather break your heart than allow your future to break you. God will cut what you want because he loves you too much to let you stay bound to what diminishes you. And the truth is, many of us would never leave certain places unless God disrupted them. You would never leave Egypt unless Pharaoh made staying unbearable. You would never leave Jonah's boat unless the storm made it impossible to stay. You would never leave the comfort of the nest unless God allowed the wind to shift beneath your wings. God uses discomfort as divine scissors. He uses conflict as spiritual pruning. He uses closed doors as construction zones for new destiny. You think your life is falling apart, but heaven knows it's coming together. God is cutting the tie, not to take something from you, but to take you somewhere greater. But here's the challenge. When God cuts, we often misinterpret it. We call it rejection, but it's protection. We call it loss, but it's liberation. We call it an attack, but it's alignment. You may cry over what God cut, and that's okay, because loss hurts even when it's necessary. But you must not retie it. You must not pick up what God put down. You must not go back to what he broke you free from. When God cuts, it will feel sudden. It will feel painful. It will feel unfair, but it will also feel like clarity once you're far enough away to see what he saved you from. Think about how many times you prayed for strength, and God answered by removing the thing that was weakening you. You prayed for peace, and he removed the person who kept you in chaos. You prayed for purpose, and he cut the distractions that kept you wandering. You prayed for wisdom, and he separated you from conversations that kept you small. God hears your prayers, But sometimes the answer comes in the form of separation. It comes in the form of God saying, this cannot go with you. And since you won't let it go, I'm cutting it for you. And even though the cut hurts, the healing reveals the wisdom behind it. There will come a day when you thank God that he did not let you keep what you wanted. You will thank him for the job you didn't get, the relationship that didn't last, the door that didn't open, the people who walked away, the ties that were severed. Because once you step into the fullness of what God had planned, you'll realize that the tie he cut was the very thing that would have strangled your future. God doesn't cut out of punishment. He cuts with precision. He cuts with purpose. He cuts with the vision of your destiny in mind. And when he cuts what you wouldn't, he is not just removing something from your life. He's removing something that was blocking the next version of you, the version of you that is stronger, wiser, freer, clearer, and more aligned with heaven's blueprint. So don't fight the cut. Don't resent it. Don't retie it. Just trust that if God had to do the cutting, it means the tie was far more dangerous than you realize. And where he's taking you is worth everything he had to remove to get you there. When God separates you from something or someone, it is rarely comfortable, but it is almost always a sign that he is elevating you. Separation is heaven's announcement that a shift is happening in your life. It means the ground beneath you is changing. It means the season around you is turning. It means God is lifting you, stretching you, preparing you for a dimension you have never walked in before. But here is the truth. Many don't realize until later, elevation always costs something. Before God raises you, he removes you. Before he promotes you, he isolates you. Before he increases you, he cuts you away from what cannot survive the altitude. Why? A plane cannot take off without leaving the ground. A rocket cannot ascend without detaching from the launch pad. And you cannot step into the next level of your calling without being separated from people, patterns, and places that were comfortable but not purposeful. Some of the separation you're experiencing right now isn't the enemy attacking you, it's God upgrading you. Because every elevation requires a shedding. Every next level requires a departure. Every divine rise requires a divine release. Many people pray for God to elevate them, but they don't understand the process that elevation demands. You think elevation means applause, but it usually begins with absence. You think it means being surrounded by supporters, but usually it means being sifted from the crowd. You think elevation means more connections, but often it means losing the ones you depended on. God separates you because elevation requires space. Space for clarity, space for growth, space for transformation. When God separates you, it is because he needs to strip away the noise so you can finally hear his voice clearly. Elevation exposes the weight of unnecessary attachments. There are people you could walk with in a lower season, but who will become a burden when God lifts you higher. There are relationships that made sense when you were broken, but no longer align with who you're becoming. There are environments you thrived in when your wings were still developing, but now that God is stretching them, the cage can no longer contain you. The higher God takes you, the fewer people can go with you, not because they are bad people, but because your calling requires altitude, and they are built for ground level. Sometimes separation is God's way of protecting your future from the limitations of your past. You may not understand why people drifted away, why opportunities closed, why circles shifted, or why relationships ended. But when God separates you, it is because he sees that what once supported you is now restricting you. And if he doesn't pull you out, you will unknowingly sabotage your own elevation by staying too low for too long. Elevation requires trust. When God begins separating you, it won't always feel spiritual at first. It might feel like rejection, abandonment, or betrayal. You may feel lonely. You may feel misunderstood. You may feel like everyone is leaving you at the very moment you need them. But that's because you are not being left behind. You are being lifted up. God is not subtracting from your life. He is refining your environment to match where you're going. It's not rejection. It's redirection. It's not loss. It's launching Look at nature. Before an eagle teaches its young to fly, it begins dismantling the nest. It removes the comfortable feathers and exposes the rough edges. Why? Because comfort kills calling. If the nest stayed soft, the eagle would never learn to soar. God does the same in your life. He removes what makes you too comfortable so you can rise into what you were created for. Separation is not punishment, it is preparation. You are not being pushed down. You are being pushed out of the nest so you can discover the wings you didn't even know you had. Some separations happen quietly, some happen violently, some happen slowly, some happen suddenly. But every separation orchestrated by God carries the fingerprint of elevation. He is not trying to isolate you to break you. He is isolating you to build you. He is cutting ties to give you clearance. He is shifting relationships to sharpen your discernment. He is reducing your circle to enlarge your influence. You cannot soar if you insist on dragging everything and everyone from your past into your next season. Think about this. When a rocket launches, the bee boosters fall off when they're no longer needed. They were essential for liftoff, but they are unnecessary for orbit. Some people were boosters in your life. They helped you get up, but they can't go with you into the next dimension. And if you try to hold on to them, your elevation will malfunction. What helped you rise at one level may hold you back at the next. This is why separation is holy. This is why God orchestrates it with such precision. He knows exactly who and what your destiny requires. If something or someone has been removed from your path, it is because God saw that your elevation would be hindered by their presence. And though you may not understand it now, you will look back and realize that the separation was the birthplace of transformation. So embrace the separation even when it feels painful. Thank God for it, even when it feels confusing. Trust it, even when it feels unfair, because separation is not the end of something. It is the beginning of something extraordinary. And once God elevates you, once you step into the space He has been preparing, you will finally understand why He had to first separate you so that nothing could hold you down when it was time for you to rise. Not everything you lose is a loss. This is a truth many people don't discover until they look back and realize that what they were crying over was actually God's mercy in disguise. We often judge our situations incorrectly because we evaluate loss by how it feels rather than by what it frees us from. When something leaves your life, your first reaction is emotional, disappointment, grief, confusion, frustration. But in the realm of the spirit, loss is not always negative. Sometimes loss is deliverance. Sometimes loss is protection. Sometimes loss is God pulling you away from what would have destroyed you, slowed you, or reshaped you into someone He never intended you to become. We use the word loss too loosely. We call it loss when someone walks away. We call it loss when an opportunity dissolves. We call it loss when a relationship ends or when we're denied something we desperately wanted. But God sees differently. God measures loss by eternity. God evaluates loss by destiny, not emotion. And many of the things you begged Him to restore were things He intentionally removed because they were not aligned with His ultimate plan for your future. What you call loss, heaven calls liberation. There are moments in life where God allows something to slip through your fingers because He knew it was too small for the version of you He is building. You were grieving something that was never meant to stay with you. You were crying over something that couldn't sustain who you are becoming. And if God had allowed you to keep it, you would have anchored your identity to something temporary and missed something eternal. You would have settled for less, all while praying for more. Not everything you lose is a loss, because some things needed to leave for you to breathe again. Some things needed to fall apart so you could finally grow. Some doors needed to close so you could stop walking in circles. Some people needed to exit so you could hear your own voice, think your own thoughts, and reclaim your peace. There are people who are attached to your insecurity, not your destiny, and when you grew, they had to go. You didn't lose them. They lost access to the version of you they could no longer manipulate, control, or contain. God will sometimes let a connection dissolve because it was contaminating your calling. You thought it was rejection, but it was actually a rescue. You thought you were being abandoned, but God was actually freeing you from something that would have burdened your future. If a relationship was draining you, limiting you, or seating you, and it ended. Thank God you didn't lose. You were delivered. Imagine how many times you prayed, God, give me peace, and the next thing you knew, someone exited your life. You prayed for strength, and suddenly a weight you'd been carrying fell away. You prayed for clarity, and suddenly confusion left with the person who was causing it. You prayed for direction, and God cleared the path by removing what was blocking your vision. Loss is sometimes God answering the prayer you forgot you prayed, but the problem is this: we romanticize what God already replaced. We mourn what God has moved. We chase after what God has freed us from. And the danger isn't in losing something. The danger is in misinterpreting the loss. When you don't understand that God uses loss as deliverance, you will try to resurrect what God buried for your benefit. You will try to return to what God rescued you from. You will try to reconnect with what God separated you from. And in doing so, you drain yourself fighting for what heaven has already released. The truth is, loss always reveals something. It reveals what you idolized. It reveals what you depended on too much. It reveals whether your trust was in God or in people. It reveals whether your hope was in your plan or His. And sometimes God allows loss for the sake of revelation, to show you who was really with you, who was really for you, and who never deserved to walk the journey with you. You don't know the value of losing until you see what the loss makes room for. You don't know the blessing of losing until God fills the gap with something that actually aligns with your purpose. You don't know the beauty of losing until you realize that loss created space for healing, growth, identity, and elevation. Some of the greatest transformations in your life didn't happen because you gained something. They happened because you lost some. King. Think of a tree that is pruned. When the gardener cuts away branches, the tree doesn't understand the process. It experiences the cut, but not the intention. Yet the branches that are removed would have hindered future fruit. Some branches are diseased, some are dead, some are draining nutrients. If the gardener doesn't cut, the tree cannot flourish. Likewise, God must sometimes prune your life. Not because He wants to harm you, but because He wants you to grow in ways you never imagined. And what feels like loss is actually divine pruning, preparation for greater fruit. You may not see the purpose of the loss right away, but time will reveal the wisdom in what God allowed. You will look back and say, if I had kept that relationship, I would never have found peace. If I had stayed in that environment, I would have lost myself. If that door had opened, it would have taken me off God's path. If that person hadn't left, I would have never discovered my strength. Not everything you lose is a loss. In fact, some losses are the greatest gifts God ever gave you. Because every time something left your life, God was making room for something better, better for your soul, better for your purpose, better for your destiny. And one day you will realize that the things you cried over were nothing compared to the things God was preparing for you. When God removes something from your life, it is never random. He is too intentional, too wise, too sovereign to cut without a cause. What God cuts is always connected to where He is taking you. And the truth many people struggle to accept is this: what God cuts is toxic to your next season. It might not have been toxic to your past. It might not have been toxic to your present, but it will be toxic to your future. And because He loves you, He will sever ties with anything that would sabotage the destiny He designed for you. You see, God doesn't just see your now, He sees your next. He doesn't just see who you are, He sees who you're becoming. And there are people, patterns, habits, and mindsets that are harmless at the level you're on, but destructive at the level God is elevating you to. A bottle of water is safe at room level, but open it in the pressure of high altitude and it bursts. Likewise, certain relationships could survive when you were spiritually immature, emotionally insecure, or desperate for affirmation. But they cannot survive the altitude of purpose, clarity, and maturity. They will explode under the weight of your calling. They will leak into your destiny. They will sabotage your growth. God knows that the next season requires a different environment, different influences, and a different version of you. So He removes anything that would pollute your potential. That's why some friendships suddenly shift. That's why certain people begin to disconnect. That's why opportunities that once looked promising unexpectedly fall apart. You think it's an attack, but sometimes it's a detox. God is cleansing your life from attachments that can't survive the demands of your next assignment. Some things are toxic not because they are evil, but because they are incompatible. You can have good people with good intentions who still aren't good for your destiny. You can have a comfortable job that pays well but suffocates your calling. You can have a relationship that feels familiar but keeps you stagnant. Toxicity doesn't always show up as harm. It often shows up as hindrance. Anything that slows your progress, dims your discernment, distracts your focus, or dilutes your identity is toxic to where God is taking you. We often underestimate the power of influence. You are shaped more by who and what surrounds you than by what you say you believe. God sees when certain people around you are weakening your standards, lowering your expectations, or feeding your insecurities. He hears conversations you don't hear. He sees motives you can't discern. And for your protection, he removes what your heart would have tolerated, but your destiny cannot afford. You may call it loss, but heaven calls it survival. Remember this, the enemy doesn't always sabotage you by sending the wrong people. Sometimes he sabotages you by keeping the wrong people. He knows that your environment is the incubator of your becoming. And God, knowing this even more deeply, steps in and cuts connections before they contaminate your next. You were praying for growth, and God began cutting. You were praying for purpose, and God began separating. You were praying for clarity, and God started removing voices that were clouding your vision. When God cuts, it's because the thing he is removing carries a poison your spirit has outgrown. It may have once comforted you, but now it will cripple you. It may have once supported you, but now it will sabotage you. Some relationships fed your wounds when you were broken, but now they starve your purpose as you heal. Some environments nurtured you when you were insecure, but now they suffocate you as you become confident. What once helped you survive could now keep you from thriving. Consider this, Israel survived in Egypt for a season, but Egypt was toxic to their promised land. Abraham needed Lot for a while, but Lot became toxic to his direction. Jonah was harmless on land, but his presence became toxic to the sailor's safety. Samson didn't realize Delilah was toxic until she drained the strength from his purpose. Toxicity isn't always obvious. It often hides behind comfort, familiarity, or emotional attachment. This is why God cuts, because what you won't recognize, he reveals. What you won't release, he removes. What you won't walk away from, he drives from you. God sees the long-term consequences of keeping what you think you need. And with divine mercy, he says, I know you love it. I know you're attached to it. But if I let you carry it into your next season, it will poison everything you're praying for. Sometimes the toxicity shows up only when you begin to grow. The moment you step into healing, the relationship becomes strained. The moment you start maturing, the friendship becomes tense. The moment you start pursuing purpose, the environment becomes uncomfortable. Growth exposes what can't grow with you. Elevation exposes what can't breathe at higher altitudes. Your next season requires purified air. So God is removing anything that pollutes it. You may question why God removed something that didn't seem harmful, but understand this, God doesn't make decisions based on your present comfort. He makes decisions based on your future calling. If it had the potential to derail you, distract you, drain you, or diminish you, God labeled it toxic and cut it before it could contaminate your purpose. And though the separation may hurt today, one day you will look back and realize that God saved you from a slow spiritual decay you didn't even see happening. You will thank him for every door he closed, every person he removed, every opportunity he blocked, and every tie he cut. Because what God cuts is toxic to your next season, and he loves you too much to let anything poisonous travel with you into your promise. When God cuts something from your life and you attempt to reattach it, you enter a cycle of regression without even realizing it. Every time you return to what God released you from, you are walking backward into a season he already delivered you out of. Retying what God has cut is not just disobedience. It is spiritual sabotage. It is choosing bondage over freedom, comfort over calling, and familiarity. Thank you over destiny. And many people don't grasp this truth until they look up and realize that they are stuck, stagnant, or sliding back into patterns they once prayed to be released. From returning to what God cut off is like trying to resurrect something God has already buried. It's like forcing open a door He tightly shut for your protection. It's like stepping out of deliverance and walking right back into the arms of what damaged you. When you retie what God cut, you are telling heaven, I trust my attachment more than your direction. That's why it always leads to regression, because God cannot elevate you while you're choosing to cling to what He removed. Regression happens quietly. It rarely shows up as a sudden collapse. It begins subtly with small compromises and old emotional patterns. You start entertaining conversations God told you to walk away from. You start responding to invitations from people who once drained you. You revisit memories and convince yourself that it wasn't that bad. You re-enter environments that once held you hostage. And gradually, you find yourself shrinking back into an old version of you that God fought to deliver. The enemy will always tempt you with the familiar, especially when you are transitioning into something new. He knows that your next level comes with discomfort, stretching, and uncertainty. He knows that unfamiliar territory can trigger fear. So he whispers lies that make your past look safer than your future. He highlights the good moments of what God cut, while hiding the pain, the dysfunction, the confusion, and the stagnation it caused. His strategy is simple: make you miss what was never meant to stay. Because if he can get you to retie it, he can keep you trapped in cycles that prevent your transformation. But here's what many people overlook. Everything God cuts has a reason behind it. When you retie it, why? Reintroduce the reason God removed it in the first place. You bring old wounds into new seasons. You bring past insecurities into present opportunities. You bring expired relationships into fresh environments. You bring habits that once hindered you into spaces designed to accelerate you. Nothing destroys momentum faster than dragging dead weight into a place God intended for growth. God knows you cannot travel far while tethered to what keeps pulling you back. Imagine trying to run a race with ropes tied to anchors behind you. Each step forward becomes heavier, slower, and harder. That is exactly what spiritual regression feels like. You are moving, but not progressing. You are trying, but not advancing. You are praying, but not breaking through, because you are tied to what God cut. Many people wonder why they experience the same emotional battles repeatedly. It's often because they reconnected with what once wounded them. They wonder why their peace evaporated. It's because they let in someone who previously disrupted it. They wonder why their confidence is shaking again. It's because they returned to voices that once belittled them. They wonder why their spiritual fire feels dim. It's because they revisited atmospheres that once suffocated it. When God cuts something, He is not trying to punish you. He is trying to protect you from regression. He knows that your destiny requires a version of you that cannot flourish while tied to the past. He knows that moving forward demands detachment from anything that pulls you backward. When you retie what God cut, you choose delay over destiny. You choose stagnation over growth. You choose old cycles over new seasons. This is why obedience matters. When God says, let it go, He is not just freeing you from something. He is freeing you for something. He cannot bring you into new land while you keep planting roots in old soil. He cannot pour new wine into old wineskins. He cannot elevate a heart still tied to burdens He removed. Every act of retying delays the blessing, the clarity, the opportunity, or the breakthrough waiting for you ahead. Even emotionally, regression shows up in subtle ways. When you reconnect with what God cut, your mindset shifts, your confidence shrinks, your discernment dulls, your joy weakens. You begin adapting to the dysfunction you were once delivered from. You begin tolerating what you once prayed against. You begin normalizing pain that God already healed. That is regression, becoming who you used to be instead of who you are becoming. When God cuts, trust Him enough to leave the thread severed, because every time you resist the urge to go back, you strengthen the future He is building inside you. Every time you refuse to retie the connection, you choose progress over comfort. You choose purpose over nostalgia. You choose destiny over delay. And the day will come when you look back and thank God that you didn't reattach what He removed. You will see that the separation made you stronger, wiser, freer, and more focused. You will realize that regression was the trap the enemy set, but obedience was the key that unlocked your elevation. So don't retire what God cut. Your future is too important. Your growth is too valuable. Your calling is too great. And your next season is too close to let anything pull you back into who you used to be. When God separates you from something, He is not just taking something away, He is making room for something greater. Divine separation is divine space making. God clears the clutter of your life, not to leave you empty, but to position you for fullness. But here's the truth, man. Why struggle with? Before God adds, He subtracts. Before He pours in, He clears out. Before He expands, He empties. And because we often don't understand this divine rhythm, the space God creates can feel uncomfortable, lonely, or even frightening. We interpret the space as loss, but God sees it as preparation. We interpret the silence as abandonment, but God sees it as fine-tuning our spirit. We interpret the gap as a void, but heaven sees it as a womb. Something is forming, something is growing, something is coming forth. The empty space is not a sign of God's absence, it is a sign of God's intention. When God creates space, He is protecting you from overcrowding. Too many voices dilute discernment. Too many attachments distract your focus. Too many relationships drain your emotional strength. Too many responsibilities suffocate your purpose. God knows that if He doesn't clear the room, you will suffocate under the weight of unnecessary people, places, and expectations. So He intentionally removes what you thought you needed so you can finally see what you actually need. Think of a sculptor chipping away stone. To the untrained eye, it may look like destruction, but to the sculptor, every piece removed reveals more of the masterpiece. In the same way, God removes, cuts, separates, and empties, not to diminish you, but to uncover the version of you that is aligned with your destiny. The space He creates around you is also space He creates within you. Space for healing, space for clarity, space for wisdom, space for a deeper relationship with Him. Many of us live too crowded. Our hearts are crowded with old heartbreaks. Our minds are crowded with fears. Our schedules are crowded with demands that don't align with our calling. Our spirits are crowded with voices that contradict God's voice. Divine separation is God saying, you cannot carry all of this and walk into hat I have prepared. So He starts clearing, and the more He clears, the more room He creates for transformation. But here's the challenge. Space often feels like loneliness. It feels like something is missing. It feels like being pulled away from familiar surroundings. And because we don't understand that the space was created by God, we rush to fill it ourselves. We fill it with distractions, with people who were never meant to be permanent, with habits that numb us, with commitments that drain us. We fill it because emptiness feels uncomfortable. But when we fill the God-created space prematurely, we sabotage what He intended to place there. God creates space because what He wants to deposit in your next season is too big to fit in your current environment. You cannot pour a gallon of destiny into a thimble of capacity. If God is calling you to greater, He must stretch your capacity, and stretching often begins with clearing. He removes the unnecessary so you can receive the extraordinary. Think of Abraham. Before God could give him the promise, He separated him from his country, his relatives, and everything familiar. God needed space. Space in Abraham's life, space in his thinking, space in his heart to do something new. Think of Gideon. God reduced his army from 32,000 to 300. It wasn't a loss, it was space making. God needed fewer people so His power could be more clearly seen. Think of Jesus removing people from the room before performing certain miracles. Why? Because doubt, noise, and disbelief crowd the atmosphere. He needed space, space for faith, space for divine power, space for transformation. God does the same with you. When you feel people drifting away, it might not be rejection. It might be God making space. When opportunities dry up, it might not be failure. It might be God shifting your capacity. When everything slows down, it might not be stagnatio. It might be God recalibrating your environment for what's coming next. The space is not a punishment, it is protection. But divine space also requires divine stewardship. What you do in the empty space determines what God fills it with. If you fill it with bitterness, you block blessing. If you fill it with fear, you hinder faith. If you fill it with distractions, you weaken discernment. But if you fill it with prayer, the presence of God will increase. If you fill it with worship, peace will overflow. If you fill it with the word, wisdom will flourish. If you fill it with surrender, God will fill it with purpose. The space God creates is holy. It is a place for recalibration, reflection, realignment, and restoration. It is a place where God whispers secrets about your destiny. It is a place where your identity is reshaped. It is a place where your eyes are open to what you could not see before. Divine space is where God prepares the soil of your life for the seeds of your future. You may feel like something is missing, but something is actually forming. You may feel like something has been taken, but something is actually being made ready to be given. You may feel like you're standing in a gap, but that gap is the doorway to a new season. So don't rush to fill the space God created. Don't run back to old attachments out of fear. Don't crowd your heart with what doesn't belong in your future. Let the space stand. Let the space breathe. Let the space prepare you. Because when God creates space, it is only a matter of time before he fills it with better, with purpose, with alignment, with blessings, with growth, and with a version of you that reflects his intention more than ever before. When God cuts something away from your life, he never leaves you empty-handed. Heaven is not in the business of subtraction without purpose. What God cuts, he replaces, but no. T with something equal, not with something similar, not with something familiar. When God replaces, he replaces with greater alignment, greater purpose, greater strength, greater clarity, and greater fulfillment. The removal was not the end. It was the clearing of the stage for what God planned next. And if you can trust him during the cutting, you will eventually praise him for the replacement. There is a divine pattern woven throughout Scripture and throughout your own life. God never removes without revealing, never subtracts without supplying, never empties without filling. The challenge is that the replacement rarely comes before the cut. There is always a gap, a space, a moment where you feel the sting of loss before you see the purpose in it. And it is in that gap between what God removed and what God will replace that your faith is tested. Will you trust him? Will you wait? Will you believe that what's coming is better than what left? We often want God to show us the replacement before he cuts. But God says, trust me with the blade, and you will see my hand in the blessing. He cannot reveal the new while you're clinging to the old. He cannot release what's next while your hands are still wrapped around what was. The replacement requires empty hands, empty space, and a surrendered heart. What God replaces is always connected to his vision for your destiny, not your comfort. When he takes away a relationship, he replaces it with companionship that strengthens rather than drains, aligns rather than distracts, and speaks life rather than confusion. When he removes a job, he replaces it with opportunities that ignite your calling instead of suffocating it. When he strips away a mindset, he replaces it with wisdom, confidence, and spiritual maturity that carry you into your next level. When he removes a habit, he replaces it with discipline, peace, and purpose. God's replacements are purposeful, not random. One of the greatest mistakes we make is trying to fill the empty space ourselves. We rush into new relationships before healing. We chase new opportunities before praying. We adopt new habits before examining our hearts. And then we wonder why nothing fits, why nothing satisfies, why everything feels temporary. It's because we are trying to replace what God removed with what our flesh desires, not what our spirit needs. Only God knows the exact replacement that aligns with your destiny. When God replaces, he doesn't do patchwork. He does transformation. He doesn't give you a version of what you lost. He gives you what you should have had all along. Something that lifts you higher instead of keeping you stuck. Something that pushes you toward purpose instead of pulling you backward. Something that reflects who you are becoming instead of who you were. God replaced Abraham's isolation with covenant. He replaced Joseph's betrayal with a throne. He replaced Ruth's grief with redemption. He replaced Paul's blindness with revelation. He replaced the disciples' sorrow with the Holy Spirit. Every divine cut was followed by divine replacement. Always greater, always intentional. And yet replacements don't always look the way we expect. Sometimes God replaces friends with mentors. Sometimes he replaces plans with purpose. Sometimes he replaces a closed door with an unexpected opportunity. Sometimes he replaces what you wanted with what you needed. Sometimes he replaces crowded rooms with sacred solitude. Sometimes he replaces applause with inner strength. Sometimes he replaces what was loud with the whisper that shapes your destiny. Do not underestimate the creativity of God's replacements. They rarely come in the package you were expecting, but when they arrive, they bring a peace the old never gave, a clarity the old never offered, and a spiritual weight the old never carried. Here's the other truth. The replacement is not always external. Sometimes what God gives you after a cut is internal transformation. He gives you courage you didn't know you had. He gives you resilience you never used before. He gives you discernment that keeps you from repeating past mistakes. He gives you wisdom that reshapes every decision you make. He gives you a deeper connection with him, a dependency that wouldn't have been possible without the separation. Sometimes the replacement is not a person. It's purpose, not a relationship, it's revelation, not a job, it's joy, not a door, it's direction, not a position, it's peace. God's best work happens inside of you before it manifests around you. And when the replacement finally shows up, you realize why God had to cut what he cut. You realize why he couldn't let certain people stay, why he couldn't let certain opportunities continue, why he couldn't allow certain relationships to survive. The replacement brings understanding. It brings closure. It brings healing. It brings gratitude for the very thing you once begged God to restore. One day you will look back on what you lost and realize it was nothing compared to what God replaced it with. The blessing was bigger. The peace was deeper, the purpose was clearer, the alignment was stronger, and the version of you that emerged was wiser, healthier, and more spiritually grounded than ever before. What God cuts, he replaces, always. Your job is to let him do the cutting, let him do the clearing, and let him choose the timing of the replacement, because when God replaces, he does it in a way that not only restores you, it elevates you. It prepares you. It positions you for the destiny that was waiting on the other side of your surrender. Here is an expanded 800-word continuation for 8, written in the same tone and style as the previous sections. Since no point 8 existed earlier, this extension follows the theme and flow of the message you've been preaching, deep, powerful, and aligned with the T.D. Jakes-style delivery you're building. Sometimes the greatest challenge in your walk with God is not the cutting, not the separation, not even the loss. It's the surrender. Point 8 is the heart of the entire journey, trusting God enough to move forward without trying to go back. When God shifts your season, he doesn't ask for your opinion, permission, or comfort. He asks for your surrender, because surrender is the bridge between what God cut and what God will create next. And without surrender, you will always be tempted to return to what feels safe instead of reaching for what is sacred. Surrender is not weakness. It is not passiveness. It is not giving up. Surrender is agreement. It is saying, God, I may not understand it, but I trust you. I may not like the process, but I know you are faithful. I may not see what's ahead, but I know who is leading me. Surrender is not letting go, it is letting God. But surrender is difficult because it demands that you relinquish control. And control is the illusion we cling to when fear whispers that we are safer managing our own lives than trusting God with them. Control convinces you that you need to hold the scissors when God is the master surgeon. Control convinces you to retie what God cut, re-enter what God closed, or revive what God buried. But surrender says, Lord, if you removed it, then I release it. If you ended it, then I accept it. If you shifted it, then I will shift with you. Surrender requires faith in the dark. It forces you to trust a map you cannot see, a path you do not fully understand, and a timing you cannot predict. That's why God leads you step by step and not season by season. Because if he showed you the whole journey at once, fear would paralyze you before faith could mobilize you. Many people say they trust God until he rearranges their life. They trust God until he cuts something they were comfortable with. They trust God until he closes a door they wanted to walk through. They trust God until he interrupts their plans. But true trust is proven when the outcome is not what you expected. Surrender is not tested when God says yes. It is tested when God says no. And surrender is not an event. It is a lifestyle. You don't surrender once. You surrender continually. Each new season requires new surrender. Each new calling requires a deeper surrender. Each blessing, each elevation, each opportunity requires a fresh yes from your spirit. Because you cannot embrace the new while clinging to the old. You cannot receive what's next while holding on to what's past. Surrender is the posture that positions you to receive. Look through scripture and you'll see it everywhere. Abraham had to surrender Isaac before he became the father of nations. Moses had to surrender his excuses before he could lead Israel. David had to surrender the throne to God's timing before he could sit on it. Ruth had to surrender her past before she stepped into her destiny. Mary had to surrender her plans before she carried the promise. Jesus surrendered his will before he fulfilled his purpose. Every great move of God begins with surrender. And the reason surrender feels like death is because something is dying. The part of you that trusts your own understanding more than God's wisdom. The part of you that wants comfort more than calling. The part of you that wants control more than covenant. Surrender kills the flesh so the spirit can live. And here is the mystery. The moment you fully surrender, you begin to see what the cutting was preparing you for. What felt like loss starts to look like freedom. What felt like separation begins to look like elevation. What felt like emptiness begins to look like expansion. Because surrender gives you spiritual vision, the ability to see what God is doing beneath the surface. Surrender doesn't guarantee immediate answers, but it guarantees alignment. And alignment with God is better than answers from man. When your will aligns with God's will, you become unstoppable, not because you are strong, but because he is guiding every step, ordering every connection, and orchestrating every opportunity. Many people delay their destiny not because God hasn't opened the door, but because they haven't surrendered the things blocking the doorway. They want to move forward while holding on to the weights of the past. They want to step into purpose while dragging old pain, old relationships, old habits, and old identities. But destiny requires travel light. You cannot carry everything with you. Some things must stay behind so that God's promise can go ahead. The beauty of surrender is that it unlocks peace. The moment you stop wrestling with God is the moment you start resting in him. The moment you stop trying to force outcomes is the moment your spirit exhales. Surrender brings clarity where confusion once lived. It brings stillness where anxiety once ruled. It brings strength where exhaustion once lingered. And eventually, surrender produces revelation. You begin to see that everything God cut was necessary. Everything he allowed was intentional. Everything he shifted was purposeful. The tears, the endings, the empty spaces, the lonely seasons, all of it was shaping you, stretching you, preparing you for a future you could not yet imagine. And when you finally step into that future, you will realize something profound. God didn't just cut to remove, he cut to redirect. He cut to reshape. He cut to refine. He cut to reveal. He cut to release your destiny. And all he needed from you was surrender.